Let's look at Chapter 2 of French for Reading, and we'll go through the first part here. In the first section, which is Chapter 10 in the textbook, we're going to look at the present tense of the indicative ER verbs. Okay, now, so what are we talking about? Present tense is the tense that means it's happening right now. It's going to be like I talk or I am talking. Those are the two main English tenses in English. It's so that's the present tense of the indicative, and the indicative is a mood. We have the indicative and the subjunctive, and we've got imperatives, but the indicative is the normal mood, the normal way of writing a verb to indicate that something happens. It indicates something. It indicates reality. So that's what we mean with the indicative, is that's the normal way of presenting something that we believe is the reality. And we're going to be looking at ER verbs. And verbs in French are classified into three different groups based on the infinitive. The infinitive is the dictionary form of the verb. That's the type of the form that you would look up in the dictionary. And somewhere between 80 and 90% of the verbs end in ER in the infinitive. So they're called the ER verbs, or the first groups of verbs. We'll see other groups of verbs. The second group ends in IR, and then the third group of verbs ends in everything else, typically RE. So let's choose as our paradigm, let's choose the verb parler, to speak. And that's where we get our word parliament, is where politicians speak. So that's where we get the word parler, or comes from the word parler, to speak. And so that's the infinitive, which means to speak, but let's look at how we use the present tense. And so what we do is we change the ER at the end to something else. So in both French and English, we separate conjugated verbs into the singular, where there's just one person doing the action, talking, or where there's in the plural down here, where you've got more than one person doing the speaking. And we separate it into first person, I, second person, you, and third person, he, she, or it. So the first person singular, the I, je parle, the ER changes to an E. That's pretty simple and straightforward, and we would translate that as I speak or I am speaking. We could also translate it as I do speak, but generally I do speak is something that you only say in oral English. You usually don't say that in written English, so we're not even going to consider that as a translation, because you'll be translating into written English, literary English, and generally we don't say I do speak. Now in the negative we might say I do not speak, but generally we translate it as I speak or I am speaking. So that would be je, the I form. The tu is the you singular form, so that would be you speak. So here we have tu parle with an es. Now they're pronounced exactly the same. Je parle, tu parle. The infinitive is pronounced parler. The R is silent, but the E at the end there is pronounced A. And that would be you speak, just meaning one person. And then the third person singular would be, you can conjugate either with il, meaning he, or elle, meaning she, would be he or she speaks. Or if in English you're talking about an inanimate object that doesn't have a gender, we would say it speaks. But in French, everything has a gender. It's either il or elle. There's no neutral it for a subject pronoun. So these are the singular, je parle, tu parles, il or elle parle, meaning translate I speak, you speak, he or she speaks. We can also translate I am speaking, you are speaking, it is speaking. Now, there's lots of ways of translating these verbs, but in these PowerPoints, I'm not going to give you every possible way of translating it. And when you do translations, you're not going to write out all the different ways of translating. You need to choose the translation that reads the smoothest and makes the most out of the context. And that's really important in translating, is that you don't give me a whole list of options. Just give me one option so I can tell what you think that it means. You wouldn't want to say I speak / am speaking. No, that's not how we write. That's not how we communicate. You look at the context to find out if I speak or I am speaking is better. Now in the plural, we have the first, second, and third person again. So the nous parlons is we speak. That would be I plus somebody else. Now, in some languages, there's a difference between we, meaning me and you, and we, meaning me and somebody else. In French and English, when we say nous, it just means me and whoever. It can be you, it can be someone else. So nous and we are very similar in English. It means that I and somebody else, who might be you, are speaking. So notice this was je parle, tu parles, il parle. Now we've got an ONS ending. And it's pronounced this time. So this is nous parlons. So this is the first one that's pronounced differently. These are spelled almost the same. We've got the silent S there. But here we've got the ONS ending. And so that's pronounced we speak or we are speaking. The vous form is you plural, meaning a group of people that I'm speaking to. Vous parlez. And so we have the ending EZ that we're going to see all the time for the plurals, the second person plural. That means you speak or you are speaking. Now notice, vous parlez is pronounced the same way as the infinitive, parler. The Z is silent, the R is silent, but at the end of the verbs, they make the E is no longer silent. Where here, the E's were silent and the S was silent too. Here we pronounce the E, vous parlez. Now the third person plural, we use il for they masculine, elle for they plural feminine. We don't, in English, we just have they for both of them. We don't make a distinction between masculine and feminine like we do with he and she. But in French, there's no neutral third person plural singular. So you always have to choose il or elle. And it's il parle. They speak. And the ending is ent, which is silent when it's on verbs. And this is like so hard to remember because there's so many words that end in ent, like most of the ant words in English. But it's pronounced when it's on a noun, but it's or an adjective or an adverb, but the ent is not pronounced when it's on a verb. So it's il parle, they speak. So they're all pronounced the same, je parle, tu parles, il parle, except for the first and second plural, nous parlons, vous parlez. And notice also that it's il parle and il parle. So in spoken French, you can't tell the difference between he speaks and they speak. You can only tell the difference based on the context. In written French, we end up getting a lot more cues. We get the S at the end of il, we get the nt at the end of parle. So written French tends to be a lot easier to understand than compared to spoken French. Now let's talk about the difference between tu and vous, the second person singular and the second person formal. So we're going to start off with tu, and it's the second person singular whenever you're talking, but it's only used in informal speech. You can't just start calling whoever you meet to. You can only do that if they're a friend, a family member, a child, or a pet, something like that. Someone that you're close to, you have this intimacy. You don't have to be guarded. You don't have to be especially polite. That's so the to is used for the second person singular and in informal situations. The vous, however, is used in all formal situations and anytime that you need the second person plural. So vous is either the second person plural or the second person formal of the singular. So when it's the second person plural, we use it for speaking to several people. In the South, they say you all. In California, we say you guys. Written English, we just say you. So that's why I am presenting you this presentation, and you meaning everybody who's watching this video. That's the plural. If I was speaking to my wife, I would use the second person singular because there's just one of her. But also, we use vous not just when we're talking to several people in a group, the vous plural. We use it for an individual to whom we want to show respect or maintain distance. So if I meet somebody the first time, I will use vous, and there's a special verb for using vous. It's called vous voyez, and there's a verb for using tutoyer. And you always start off by using the vous form of the verb when you speak to somebody, unless it's a children or a pet. Dogs, you can tutoie anytime that you want. They're perfectly fine with it. Cats, sometimes it's a little bit iffy if you have to use the formal or the informal, but generally they'll let you use the informal. So the vous is the second person plural, or it's the formal you. So let's talk more about translating the present tense. And like I said before, you need to base it on the context. So if we have a sentence, j'habite à Paris. So habite, that comes from the verb habiter, to habitate, but we wouldn't say habitate, we say live, and the je is the je, and the je contracts in front of vowels and silent h's. So that's why the je is just the j apostrophe here. So that's j'habite à Paris, and that can be translated as I live in Paris or I am living in Paris. And there's a slight difference in the question. So if somebody asked what I habitually do, they say, "Oh, Dave, where do you live?" I can say, "Oh, I live in Paris." But if they're asking what I'm doing at this specific moment, because they know I move around a lot, and they say, "Oh, where are you living?" I could say, "I'm living in Paris," meaning, whoa, this is what I'm doing right now. It might not be what I do in the future, it might not be what I do in the past, but that's what I'm doing right now. Now they're both present tense, and they're both only giving information about what's happening right now, but I live in Paris is more habitual, more normal, more stable, whereas I am living in Paris is more temporal, putting a focus on the moment there. Now in English I could say I do live in Paris, but that's not how we're going to translate it in written French very often. Now, what we have here is we have an exercise, and what you need to do is you're going to the video will end after this exercise, and you need to translate these sentences before going on to the next video, which will give you answers to these. And this is a super important part of the course. You can use the slides to translate them, and definitely you can use your dictionary, but this is what's going to force you to put into practice the last few slides that we've gone through before you go on to the next section. Now, in this present tense exercise, we've got 4 verbs. We've got aimer, which is going to be, which means to like or to love. And it's interesting, in French, we have the same verb for both. And it's one of those things like, oh, that must be horrible to not be able to distinguish between like and love. Well, it turns out that so much is dependent on the context that you never really have to worry about the ambiguity if you know what the context is. It's not an issue. So in French, in English, you want to translate it either as to like or to love, depending on the context. The next verb that we have here is trouver, and that means to find. Parler, we've seen that means to speak. And then I'm also going to introduce the verb sembler, to seem. He seems to be tired, or he seems to want to go to sleep, or he seems like he's going to fall over because he's so tired. I hope that's not you, because we're just starting this course. We've got a long way to go. But all of these verbs are ER verbs. They're regular ER verbs, so they're going to conjugate just like parler, just what we saw on the other slides. And so here we have 7 sentences, and I want you to get out a piece of paper, or if you've got several screens, you could do it. You can just type up the answer in English, but translate it in beautiful English. Now, there's several ways that you can translate these. If there's not enough context given, either way will be right. So don't worry about getting the exact right idea or getting the right words exactly when you translate it, but make sure that you've got the idea and that any variations on those ideas, if it's not specified by the context, if it means the same within the range of meaning of the verb, that would be fine. Okay, so we're going to end this presentation, and after you have translated and written out your translation, you can look at the next the next video to see how you did.